This is the view from Jeanie McIntosh's car as we drove through the village of Silverdale. The whole district of Silverdale being an archaic realm in the most northerly echelons of Lancashire, wreathed in ancient myths, spurious folklore and monstrous sheep-eating worms. No, seriously, we're not kidding about that last one. On a knoll outside the village, just opposite Challen Hall to be precise, stands the Buck Stone, also known as the Logan Stone for reasons we haven't been able to pin down, and or the Rocking Stone depending on your mood. Because apparently, if you push it, it rocks. I was going to test this out on Jeanie McIntosh, but then I realised it would have been a long walk home if successful. Anyhow, said Buck Stone, named after the deer which once inhabited the area, apparently, is in fact a glacial boulder, 13 feet high and 33 feet in circumference. A 60-ton Ice Age deposit, broken loose from the cliff above, and left for thousands of years to marinate in legend. A legend which runs like this. Centuries ago, a gigantic serpent lived roughly 300 yards away from the Buck Stone in Hawes Tarn. This fearsome, bad-tempered creature had a habit of rising from the lake every time it was hungry, coiling itself around the Buck Stone and then waiting patiently for any short-sighted sheep to amble past. Needless to say, wool was in short supply around Silverdale. Eventually, the dragon was killed and a whole fleece was discovered in the hollow of one of its teeth. History doesn't record who saw the dragon off, but Roger de Conyers, who actually lived in Durham but was presumably connected to Jarl and Conyers in some fashion, was renowned as a famous worm slayer down south. This might just have been a euphemism, you can never tell with aristocrats. The Buck Stone Serpent wasn't the only giant worm in Silverdale. Sigmund Freud would have a field day round these parts. In the 18th century, Reverend William Hutton recorded that the place was full of snakes called hagworms from being in hags or woods. Some of these have grown hairy and so large as to swallow small birds alive, a fact I am assured of from good authority. One local legend says, presumably on the same good authority, that a young boy saw a hagworm fly past him. Yes, apparently they could fly as well, and land in a nearby tree. Naturally, after telling the rest of the village, some of the residents, acting on the usual good authority no doubt, burned the tree down, killing the hagworm in the process. At this point you're probably wondering whether there's a certain amount of inbreeding around Silverdale. We were too, so we did a bit of research and came across this anonymous review online. A wild camp just above the high tide mark on Silverdale Beach, out of sight of the locals, who are for the most part elderly or reclusive yet friendly pissheads. Fair enough, blunt perhaps, but it explains a lot. One of the farmhouses at Silverdale is worth a mention at this point, the 17th century Lindeth Lodge, known to the locals as Wolf House, because, according to legend once again, the last wolf in England was killed nearby, possibly by 3 little pigs. This was obviously considered an heroic feat rather than an ecological disaster because somebody erected a coat of arms embellished with a wolf's head on the outside wall of the building. Lindeth Lodge, of course, shouldn't be confused with Lindeth Tower, which stands just around the corner. The idyllic Lindeth Tower, looking like the sort of place that Patrick McGowan might have inhabited in The Prisoner, is actually a Grade 2 listed Victorian folly, built in 1842 by the Preston banker Hesketh Fleetwood. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote her novel Ruth there in the 1840s. And we mustn't forget the Silverdale Hoard while we're in this neck of the woods, not to be confused with the Quedale Hoard, a collection of over 200 pieces of silver Viking jewellery, unearthed inside a lead container in 2011. The hoard is now housed in Lancaster Museum and includes a coin stamped with a previously unknown Viking ruler, which is interesting, possibly. Then there's Jenny Brown's Point, which deserves its own folktale, if only because of its enigmatic name. History doesn't record with any certainty exactly who Jenny Brown was, but one of the many local myths, heavy with cliched, predictable romance, claims that the titular Jenny Brown, after her lover had sailed abroad to fight in a war, sat on the rocks for many years, not realising that he'd been almost immediately killed in battle, awaiting his return until she eventually dropped dead. Another, less poetic legend claimed that Jenny Brown was in fact an old biddy who kept pigs, and that was that. Not really legend material, that one. And yet another, perhaps more feasible explanation, all matters considered, reckons that Jenny is a mispronunciation of Ginny, dialectically referring to the engine that was used to crush copper ore from the quarry next door, which would also explain the big chimney. We didn't find the big chimney, which is why we had to borrow a photograph of it off Google Images. Jeanie McIntosh's arthritic knees gave up en route, as did my patience, so we abandoned our ramble around the vertiginous Jenny Brown's Point in favour of the even more vertiginous Fairy Steps. The Fairy Steps at Beetham are allegedly a natural flight of stairs set within a narrow claustrophobic passageway. Where legend claims, I said there are a lot of legends around this district, that if a person could ascend or descend the stairs without touching the walls, the fairies would grant them a wish. Given that my wish was for Jeanie McIntosh to get wedged about halfway up, I stupidly thought I couldn't fail. Unfortunately, she couldn't actually squeeze her industrial Zimmer through the entrance, so that was that. To be fair, the steps are dangerously narrow and impossibly steep, and anybody who managed to get to the top of them without touching the sides would have to be thinner than Calista Flockhart during Lent, with legs longer than Vernon Kay's after a stretching accident. The steps stand on what was once the old pallbearers' road. At one time, when a resident of one of the outlying farms kicked the bucket, their corpse was stuffed into a coffin and carried along said coffin route to St Michael's Church in Beetham, which is probably worth a film in its own right, via the aforementioned steps. If you look closely with your specs on, you can still see where the iron rings were driven into the wall to help the coffin bearers winch the coffins up. At least, that's what the history books tell us. I suspect it was a load of old cobblers myself. The corpses would have had to have been steamrolled and put into envelopes rather than coffins, as far as I can see. All matters considered, it would have been easier to have been buried in the back garden next to the hamster. That's enough difficult to believe history and folklore for this particular episode. Click like and subscribe if you want. Go on, it's healthy for you in the same way that bathing in the sea off Fleetwood isn't. And we'll be back again with another episode as soon as we can be bothered.